Hello, good morning, and welcome everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce this debate. My name is Clara Carvalho from ISCTE and the Center for International Studies in Lisbon. And we are today introducing a debate on the European Union, African Union Summit that is expected to happen somewhere in this first semester. Actually, this summit was first scheduled for late 2020, but due to COVID, it has been postponed, and we don't really know when it's going to happen right now. This was just by hazard or just because of COVID. But it is really a meaningful one, as it is going to occur during the Lisbon presidency of the European Union. And of course, everything that deals with the African continent and the African Union is usually used in Portugal as one of the main subjects and one of the main thematics and objectives of the Portuguese government. It was not by hazard that also the summit in Lisbon in 2007 was one that launched the joint Africa-EU strategy. Already, the Portuguese Prime Minister has stated the importance of having it conducted during the Portuguese presidency of the European Union. And remember that the African continent is not only the neighboring continent, it is also the continent with which we have a more intensive relationship and that we have to deepen throughout this century. And he quoted the creation of the Continental Free Trade Area in Africa, a project to which the European Union can provide political and technical support based on its experience of several years in a free trade area in Europe. He also remembered the support to a Nigeria candidacy for the General Directorate World Trade Organization. So, we have here a lot to discuss about concerning what kind of support is this? Is this just important for the European Union? What is the importance of this summit for the African Union? What kind of negotiations are we going ahead with, and what is going to be on our table? To debate this, we have here a group of speakers that I'm really glad to introduce right now. I would start with Christine Hackenesch from the German Development Institute. She's the head of program and research program Inter and Transnational Cooperation at this institute. We also have with us Faten Aggad, who has a long experience with UNDP, SAIA, and also ECDPM. And she's an expert in the relations between the African Union and the European Union. And we have Tanya Cox, who is the current director from CONCORD, that is the European Confederation for Relief and Development, and has been for quite a long time an expert in leading the European organizations to influence the European Union position in the sustainable development negotiations and in pushing for a people and planet-centered approach at that level. So with this wonderful group of discussants, we are going to start by discussing what are the priorities in the European Union, African Union, or African Union, European Union discussion right now, and particular to ask what is the priority both for European Union and for the African Union of the so-called Green Deal and what comes up with it. And I will give immediately the floor to Christine Hackenesch. Please, Christine.
Thank you, Clara, for the very warm introduction and also for having us. I'm looking forward to discussing with all of you over the next 1.5 hours. And so if we start with the priorities for EU-Africa cooperation, green transitions is certainly a very important topic that is coming up. We will be discussing others, but green transitions is certainly high on the agenda. And in my view, there's huge potential in closer cooperation between the European Union and the African Union on green transitions, because it's an area where I think both sides can find common interest, but it's also an area where both sides actually have to learn and can learn together. So it's not an area where the problems are on one side and the other side has the solution, but it's something where both continents need to learn and can thereby maybe also foster a different type of partnership and close cooperation. But in order to make this a huge potential for cooperation, I think one has to start by acknowledging that Europe and Africa come to this debate from very, very different angles. Because the European Union has historically been a large CO2 emitter, of course, and is currently still a very large CO2 emitter. The EU now has developed with the European Green Deal a very ambitious project for Europe itself to reduce and to abolish CO2 emissions by 2050 and reduce CO2 emissions by 55% by 2030. And this is first of all a European project, but the EU needs international partners in order to implement this project. And there, Africa, in cooperation with Africa, I think can have a key role in that. But I mean, it is clear that first the EU needs to act by itself and needs to make its own contribution in order to reduce CO2 emissions and find a different way of working economically and I mean organizing its economies. And green transitions on the African continent, I think, are discussed in different terms slightly. Because on the African side, I mean, there is still a huge need for access to electricity, for instance. More than 400 million people in Africa currently are still not having enough access to electricity. So there is a huge demand for support in access to electricity. African countries historically have contributed almost nothing to global warming and therefore, and currently still contribute very little. So it's also a question of historical responsibilities that comes in. And when we speak about green transitions, demands should be higher for the European side compared to the African side, of course, in adapting. And while African countries have contributed very little to global warming, they're hugely affected by the impact of climate change. And there's a big question on adaptation and finance and international support for adaptation. And maybe Faten and Tanya can also come in on that. But my impression is that there is debates in Africa on green transitions are also changing. And it's maybe seen more strongly also as an economic opportunity because the cards are changing now, not just with the European plans, but also China has announced that it will move towards carbon neutrality towards 2060. And we have a new president in the United States very soon who is going to probably come back to the Paris Agreement. And in order to implement these objectives, it means huge economic transformations that maybe there can also be a question of what's Africa's global role in that. And maybe this is also an opportunity to position African countries differently in the global debate. And my impression is that debates on this are changing on the African continent right now. And therefore there are a lot of opportunities as well. Debates are still early, I would say, and a lot to discuss ahead and during the summit and in the after the summit. I leave it here for now. Back over to you, Clara.
Thank you. I don't know if Faten or Tanya wants to come in on this bill.
Yes, if I may, Clara, I think there's, well, first let me say, as I'm coming in for the first time, good morning to everybody who's listening, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I would agree with Christine that the issue of climate, not Green Deal, but climate change is an important topic for the partnership. And I do make that distinction. I think it's very important to distinguish and introduce that nuance when we're talking about climate, introduce that nuance between the Paris climate agreement, to which All African countries are signatories. I think the commitment there is very strong, despite indeed the historical limited contribution to the situation that the globe finds itself in today. There is strong commitment to Paris. The Green Deal is something else. The Green Deal is obviously a European tool for its own economic recovery, but it's, one can argue, much more ambitious than the targets set in the Paris Agreement. And it is there that the potential tension when it comes to Africa emerges. A reminder that under the Paris Agreement, and the reason why African countries were particularly engaged with the Paris Agreement, is that it introduced safeguards for African countries, not just Africa, but the developing or the traditionally non-large polluters in the world, acknowledging the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. That is a very central principle in the Paris Agreement. When one looks at the Green Deal, those safeguards are dropped indirectly, one might argue. If one looks at the carbon tax proposal, for instance, the potential ramifications on Africa for of the carbon tax can be tremendous in terms of notably in terms of trade between the two continents. Africa already does have issues accessing the European markets because of different blockages there, and something such as the carbon tax can only make it much more difficult. So Europe, in introducing its Green Deal, I think, needs to be commended for being ambitious. But I think it should also be encouraged to recognize the ramifications of some of its internal action on external action. And there may be a need for some differentiated engagement when it comes to the external action. I mean, we're aware of the reasons as to why the carbon tax, for instance, the EU wants to introduce it. But the ramifications on Africa need to be kept in mind squarely. So. The other element in the Paris Agreement that was key for African countries is some type of compensation mechanism. The $120 billion that the large polluters were supposed to provide to less polluting regions in order to speed up the process to allow them, in fact, to introduce more climate-friendly measures related to adaptation, etc. We have not yet met that input, if I can put it that way, to facilitate that transition. And so the question here is Europe and other large polluters, by introducing some some internal measures, and are they slowly departing from a multilaterally agreed agreement that the Paris Agreement is? And I think, to me, I would really encourage introducing the nuancing. So Africa is committed to climate, but there are major risks with the Green Deal because of its nature and the measures it wants to introduce.
Thank you, Faten. Tanya, would you like to pop in?
Yeah, thank you very much. So good morning, everybody. It's lovely to be with you, and thank you very much for this invitation to join you all. Of course, I do agree with both Faten and Christina in what they've said. And maybe just to explain, I'll come from slightly more of a European perspective, in the sense that CONCORD is an advocacy body trying to improve the EU's policies. So that's where we're coming from all the time when we speak. I think the most important thing is, of course, to recognise, as Faten did, the ambition that the EU has to improve the situation as regards the planet, let's say. I think it goes a little bit beyond just climate and climate change, even if that is predominant. It is indeed a very high priority for the EU, and it's one of their top 5 priorities indeed. And they are inserting this in everything that they do. And I think that there are therefore the pluses of that, but there are some drawbacks to that. if we look, for example, at the strategy that the EU drew up in principle with Africa back in March last year, 2020, their European Green Deal was definitely a part of it. It was an important part of it for them. And I think it's too soon to say whether they're necessarily departing from the multilateral agreement and multilateral system, which is Paris, but I entirely agree with putting that caution out there. So I agree with you there, Faten. It could be that through the external angle of the European Green Deal, of course, they might try to implement the Paris Agreement. But I think that this brings me to perhaps the real question, and that is, it isn't whether the European Green Deal would be good or would be helpful, but rather what it entails and who's in the driving seat and what are the motives. And the way the EU presents things, and of course the way it comes across with its strategy, it is in the driving seat at this particular juncture anyway. And so what really needs to happen now is that we make sure that the perspectives of the African nations are also included in whatever joint efforts are going to be made going forward to address climate change and environmental degradation. And I would like to stress that this environmental degradation angle is extraordinarily important as well. The climate is hugely important, but so is the environment more generally. The way we see it, there's more of an economic drive in this approach to sort of, the green economy and having a sustainable and inclusive green economy than an actual recognition, perhaps, of the urgency of protecting ecosystems and the people who depend on those ecosystems. And it's very often this people perspective that we find is missing in much of what the EU does, even if we can be complimentary about some of the proposals that the EU puts forward. I'd like to just remind everybody that the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, actually said that the Green Deal is Europe's new growth strategy. Now that, for me, definitely is worrying. Not least just because the idea of growth per se can be dangerous for the climate and for the planet. It is because of our drive for growth and putting the pressure on economic consumption and production that we are where we are today. So I think that there's a lot that needs to be done around this. I would also flag that chasing this idea of growth doesn't necessarily mean that we end up with greater well-being for people and planet. So we need to be very, very careful, I think, that how we implement the Green Deal and what's included in it and taking into perspective the African priorities is crucial. Now, I recognise, of course, that we might come across as idealistic. Up to a point, of course, we are. But we do believe that a mission-oriented approach is more important than this economic drive and that angle to looking at the Green Deal. We need a clear direction for change. Now, of course, this means that the change needs to occur at all levels. So all levels need to be included. And one of the things that I'll probably come back to while we're talking is that there needs to be much more consultation then around what both the African side and the European side would like to work on jointly together when it comes to the climate change and improving the environment for everybody. Maybe I'll leave it there and open up again back to Christine and Faten for more comments.
Yeah, Christine, please go ahead.
Thank you. I would just like to come back to one or 2 points. Faten, when you say there is a number of risks involved with the Green Deal for EU-Africa cooperation, I share that view and see those points. And I mean, there is controversial discussion also going on with regard to the carbon border adjustment mechanism. But I think, one has to see that in any case, if the EU is going to implement the Green Deal domestically, it will have repercussions for international cooperation just because of the size of the EU's market. And if the EU was really going to move towards green energy, for instance, I mean, this might even have bigger implications for cooperation with Africa than the carbon border mechanism, because a lot of exports from Africa towards the EU is still a raw material, and a lot of that in energy. So I think it's a matter of fact that there will be implications for international partners, and it's indeed a very important question to ask. How can these ramifications be managed in a way that they don't have negative repercussions and implications, in particularly for least developed countries and for other partners who have difficulties to adjust to that. But I think there's also a different perspective one can take on the Green Deal, which is that it also has quite some opportunities, I think, for African countries, depending on what the interest is on the African side. Because, I mean, the Green Deal is not just about climate and CO2 emissions, but it's also about electromobility, for instance, where the EU will depend on imports, on raw material imports. And a lot of that is coming from African countries. And I think this will foster a new debate of value addition and of what is the position of countries in different places on the value chain, and how can they leverage how can they leverage that position differently? And similar, I mean, if the EU wants to move towards green energy, it will be difficult to produce all that energy within Europe itself. So there's already a discussion on hydrogen, which is also controversial, but I think it's not just a question of how to reduce the negative impacts, but I think it has, there are huge opportunities involved, but it depends also to what African countries want from that and how they use the potential leverage that they also have in that cooperation. Because the EU will not be able to implement the Green Deal by itself. And I think it would, partners should use the leverage that they have in order to make the best for them out of that.
If I may, just a very quick point there. I think I do agree that from a resource perspective, it may be interesting, but that's precisely the trap that African countries are trying to get out of. If one looks at, I think Clara in the introduction was talking about the CFTA, that's an industrialization a drive for the continent. So ideally, the continent should not be exporting raw materials at the same level that it is doing now. And, I'm well aware, for instance, that under the Green Deal, there's an entire component on creating a certain level of European autonomy when it comes to access to natural resources. But the risk there in itself, I agree, it can be a leverage, but it can also become a risk of perpetuating this dependency of exports that are largely commodity-driven exports. So I think there is a way to try and break away from that. And one key to doing that is investment promotion. Investment promotion, I think, can be done by promoting more green-driven investment. But Africa's need is really, it's so diverse that alone may not help in the current industrialization drive. But key is investment. And the question, and maybe that opens a whole other area of discussion is, have we been able, realistically speaking, in the last 20 years to really promote solid EU investment? And that includes investment in infrastructure, for instance. If we're speaking of green, producing in a green way would require, obviously, diversification, for instance, of energy production, sources, solar energy, investment in solar energy, investment in wind energy and hydro energy. But all of that requires major investment. So that's infrastructure investments. And the question is, has Europe so far been able to deliver on that infrastructure investment in a way that meets the demand?
Yeah, I think that Tanya wanted to add something.
Yeah, I was going to head in the same direction as where Faten ended up, so this is quite convenient. I think that indeed this is where the EU could play a supportive role, and that is to shift where it invests its money, because currently quite a lot of its money still is invested with the EIB or wherever in fossil fuel industry. If it shifted this into renewable energy and indeed in supporting infrastructure development so that Africa can produce renewable energy, clean renewable energy, I think then that would head in the direction that Christine was probably trying to take us with, saying that Africa could actually export that back to Europe. The question then is, of course, can Africa export it back to Europe at proper prices, at real prices, at meaningful prices, not like what happens at the moment with its raw materials, where it is exporting them at low prices. And it's kept in that situation. So this is also speaking to the nature of the relationship between the EU and Africa to try and equalize it a little bit and make it more meaningful or more genuine. The other thing that I think the EU could probably help with is that, I mean, there are a lot of initiatives in Africa, all over Africa, with small, innovative, renewable energy projects. The challenge, I think, is getting them to scale up. And perhaps this is also where the EU could play a role. Also making sure that, you know, there's both on-grid and off-grid energy available, so that then in the rural communities, they also have energy provision, because this is one of the biggest challenges at the moment in Africa. Just on taxation, one very small point. One of the things that we would be really keen to see is that taxation in general, and our approach to taxation, is that we move it off salaries and onto energy and materials use. Now, of course, one has to be extremely careful when one's talking about energy use, that people don't end up suffering here. So this is something where when one's talking about taxation on energy, one has to be very nuanced, and I'm well aware of that. But anyway, I think that the idea of tax incentives and disincentives could be useful, particularly when we're trying to tackle high polluters. And of course, that's also important. And to decrease material content per product and things like this. So there's a lot one can do around tax that can be interesting and innovative. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. Faten has already mentioned it, but just after the Paris Agreement, there was the idea of having a tax on carbon issues. Do you think that will be possible to implement right now within this relation between the EU and the African Union or not? Faten?
Christine, maybe that's more your, yeah.
Well, I mean, you mean the carbon border adjustment mechanism?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a proposal that has been put on the table as part of the European Green Deal, and it would, of course, apply to the EU, to all of the EU's relations with external partners. But it would need to be made sure that, especially for the low-income countries, the effects are taken enough into consideration. And what I understand is that the specific design of that tax is still to be debated currently, and a proposal might be on the table around June this year or a bit later. And I think it depends very much on how exactly the design will look like, what the implications then are for African countries. So one proposal is to limit it to specific sectors that have a particularly high carbon intensity, like cement or aluminium. And then one would have to see, I mean, which exports from African countries would be particularly affected by that. And there are discussions or proposals that, for instance, LDCs could be exempted, but this would, of course, only then apply for some African countries and maybe not to those who would really be affected by the mechanism. So I think, I mean, it's a bit, for me personally, it's a bit early to see, because we need to wait for how the proposal exactly will look like. But I think it's a topic where certainly it's very important that there is a close dialogue with African partners during the preparation of that, in order to make sure that the implications are taken into consideration from the very beginning, and not just when the decisions have been taken, so to say.
Yeah. We also have been discussing here what are the main implications for leveraging African economies, and something that is over the table is the so-called fourth revolution and fourth industrial revolution. But what kind of industrialization are we speaking now when we speak about the African continent, and how is it going to be levered? Faten has already spoken about investment, but what are your views on it?
I think the advantage that the African continent now has is the so-called latecomers advantage, and I think the type of industrialization that the continent should be looking at is one that embraces the new technologies that we have at our disposal today. And I think there, in terms of the link to our previous conversation, it's then a question of access to these new technologies, affordability of these new technologies, and adapting them, of course. So I think there is a potential of creating a new industrialization, a new pathway to industrialization that is friendlier. I think on whether it's friendlier to the climate, of course. To the extent to which it would be friendly, obviously depends on the amount of investments in largely, to be honest, in infrastructure and access to these new technologies. But it's a necessary path anyway, I think, for the continent. If one looks at the type of intra-African export, for instance, where the jobs are created. And let's not forget that Africa has a youth bulge at the moment. And we often speak of the youth bulge in Africa as an advantage. It's an advantage if we manage to capture it and use it productively. And I think the industrialization agenda provides that. And if one looks within the continent, the intra-Africa trade is one that's far more diversified than trade towards Europe, which is very much extractive-led. The types of exports within the continent are diverse, and therefore it's in sectors that are more productive and that tend to absorb much more of the people available in the job market. So I think industrialization will be a necessary path, I think, to cater for so many things that the continent struggles with at the moment.
Thank you, Faten. And when we speak about this fourth industrial revolution, we are speaking about digitalization, artificial intelligence, cloud computing, robotics, 3D printing, really fancy and up-to-date subject. But also when we speak about, as Faten was speaking about, improving trade within Africa, industrialization within African as a latecomer, we also have, for instance, a point of view from Carlos Lopes, who is now the negotiator between the African Union and the European Union. And he speaks about kind of not so up-to-date industrialization. Actually, a kind of a second level industrialization. And what is really on the table here? Are we speaking about these kind of objectives that are mainly related with digitalization and the new perspectives for a new economy all around the world, in a continent where we have so many young people that are coming into the employment, into the market and into the age of getting some employment, and they don't have really the right skills for entering it? Or are we speaking about a more down-to-earth industrialization and first transformation of raw products?
I can take that one. I think it's both. I think one does not exclude the other. I think it also depends on sectors, of course. I think some sectors would still require low skilled labor as such. Others would require high skilled labor, which, I mean, some of it is available on the continent. I mean, if one looks, for instance, at not in relation particularly to industrialization, but in relation to services, for instance, there are quite a number of skills, for instance, in the digital banking sector that is, you know, quite advanced on the continent. But I would agree with you, Clara. I think you mentioned the issue of digitization, but and the reason why I was saying it, the type of industrialization that the African continent can go for will depend on the type of investments, money input that we will put to upgrade certain things. I mean, if one looks at the digital agenda or a digital infrastructure in the African continent, it still requires, you know, even basic things in terms of access to internet, for instance. It still does require some massive investments, and I mean those investments have so far come from China. I believe 70% of digital infrastructure is Huawei, for at least for 4G. I believe 5G it's almost universal, but there is a need to look at it as an agenda that is key for Africa. And not necessarily as a battlefield for international partners, but as an agenda, I think, purely looking at investment that needs to serve the continent. So some of these things, and I mean, we can go into issues of intellectual property rights with respect to new technologies, but that can also be tackled through stronger partnerships in the area of science and technology, more mobility. I think we often think that one puts the money there and those skills will develop, but I think it's mobility is as important when it comes to science and technology, for Africans included, to be able to develop that capability within the continent itself. So we're looking at, and I think we can go at it in different speeds, if I can put it that way. But it's there are different pathways that we can use, being facilitating access to intellectual property rights, investment in S&T, etc.
Thank you, Faten. Actually, we do have now a question from our chat from Nuno Kerk, who tell us that he visit half of the African countries. Shouldn't the focus be on agriculture, education, and health, when self-sufficiency in food is achieved along with a proper education and health? So that is really a question about food security and how is it achieved. Is that still an issue when we discuss about this kind of new economic development in African countries? How is it going to be achieved? And like a kind of a first step before discussing industrialization, that is our question. So I think that Christine was first, and then Tanya. Christine, yeah.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I mean, Faten also said that, I mean, there are many sectors that are potentially relevant, and I would very much agree with that. I mean, when we think of where is socioeconomic development to come from over the next couple of years and decades in order to create jobs and create prosperity in African societies, then I think it's really important to think about a mix of sectors that can potentially drive this process. And I think Nuno is right that agriculture can also be an important one. education is a key precondition, of course, for any type of economic development. But then I think another sector that we haven't discussed so far yet is urbanization. I mean, there's a huge drive towards cities, the large cities, but also middle cities in African countries. And I think investments in urban development of different types can also be an area where there's a lot to expect for job creation and economic transformation. And linkages between rural areas and the middle cities might also be very important. So I think there's really a mix of factors that might be key. And I mean, as we, because of Corona, we are also discussing about reshaping of global value chains and reshaping of economic structures. And so I think there is really a bigger question to ask, I mean, how do African countries and societies define their place within the global economic system in this changed context? And where do they want to invest strategically in order to create jobs and make contributions also at towards the global level?
Thanks, Christine. Tanya, you also wanted to add something.
Yeah, thank you very much. Maybe just to also take this opportunity to rebound on what others have been saying, but I completely agree that obviously health, agriculture, and I would say good nutrition, food security are extremely important as in Africa. There's no question about that. And I would say that the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us just how important actually and how linked all these things are. And I think that this was one of the things that the SDGs agenda, so the 2030 agenda, was trying to get at, especially in the way it was constructed with the linkages between all these things. And we know that Africa has one of the world's highest, the highest prevalence of hungry people, with 20% of its population being hungry. But at the same time, it has the largest amount of uncultivated arable land. And there's a paradox here. And I think we also need to be looking at why these situations exist. Now, obviously, I come from this European perspective, as I said before, and certainly one of the reasons is because of the relations that Africa has had, say, with European countries and the agreements that it has put in place, maybe with some coercion, I would say, or not much room for maneuver, perhaps would be a better, maybe more nuanced way of saying it. So that where they used to be quite self-sufficient, food sufficient, now this situation has changed because in certain agreements the certain amount of pressure has been brought to bear to focus on one or other crop for export. And this means then that they are no longer they're not so resilient when shocks come around. It has also actually led to biodiversity loss and environmental degradation, going back to the conversation before. But there are many countries in Africa that now find themselves in a situation where indeed they focus on a certain smaller number of crops, and they now need to, I think, also diversify in their agriculture. Faten was talking about diversifying in industry. I think there's a lot that needs to be done in Africa so that Africa can really be independent of foreign powers, let's say, to put it simply. I think we also need to remember who does the agriculture. If we're going to be talking about agriculture, this is largely women. But it's hugely important in Africa. So I absolutely agree that, yes, a lot needs to be done for Africa to become more independent and more self-sufficient, also from then a food security perspective. Now, one of the things that if I sort of move towards the industrialization and the economic side of the argument, one of the things that we've seen is with the free trade agreements that, for example, has been drawn up with the EU, these tend to be skewed in favor of these standardized industrial models of production. And that doesn't really suit how Africa has typically worked. And it definitely negatively impacts on small scale farmers, because it discourages local production and consumption. So, one of the things that's going to have to be addressed is this sort of agri-food exports as well that come then from the EU, like dairy products. We hear a lot about the poultry, and they are undercutting the prices and by flooding the African markets. And this is also a big problem. So I mean, I think there are many things that need to be done when we're talking about food security, nutrition, agriculture, to sort of rebalance the situation a little bit. If I could just, while I have the mic in inverted commas, say a couple of words on what Faten and Christine were also saying on the economy and investment, and you were talking about the fourth industrial revolution with digitalisation, Clara. I would agree very much with Faten that these two go hand in hand. It's not one or the other. We've even started seeing a situation in Africa where there is deindustrialization. And I think that this needs to be of considerable concern to all of us. So one of the priorities that Africa, I imagine, would be drawing up for is going to be diversifying investment to support the African domestic economies, yes, rooted in green technologies, but in other things as well, most particularly to develop their local value chains. This is one of the things that we've also seen, thanks to the COVID-19 pandemic, that we now need to reconfigure and rethink value chains so that we're not dependent just on imports or exports from any one country, and that we can be all a little bit more self-sufficient and independent, or have a number of different countries that we can go to if we need imports. In the context of Africa, one of the things that we have been promoting considerably is that the fact that the focus really needs to be in this process of diversification of its industry and its investment. The focus needs to be on the micro, small and medium enterprises. And this is extremely important when we talk about that youth bulge that you were mentioning, Clara, because it is the smaller enterprises that employ many more people. It is not the big multinationals that will come into Africa and maybe invest a bit, but they're not the ones that employ the most numbers of people. So in terms of getting people into jobs, also upskilling them, it really is focusing on the smaller enterprises. And preferably, from our perspective at least, we would be saying those that are more socially oriented. So part of the social and solidarity economy, those that put people at the center, and then look out for each other when, say, a crisis strikes like COVID-19 or another one, so that we can support each other. When it comes to digitalization, the one thing that I would just like to flag that we've had a tendency to focus a little bit on sort of the infrastructure side of things and the investments that are necessary, which is absolutely true. But I would focus perhaps on maybe the human side of it, just to say, and to reiterate perhaps what Faten also said, and that's the skills that are necessary. Actually, yes, there's very limited connectivity in Africa, and that does need to be improved, of course, but there are, I mean, millions and millions of people who don't even know that digital technology exists and that the internet exists. So there's a huge amount of awareness raising and education to be done as well, particularly in rural communities and among women and girls.
Thank you, Tanya. You raised a lot of questions that really need to be discussed here. And I might just take the first one from our commenter panel, from Mariana Leite. And what she's telling us is that Faten raised an interesting point around geopolitics, around China, European Union and African Union relations. I wonder what are the panelists' thoughts on the role of the COVID recovery and vaccination plans. As you had just mentioned, COVID, and I don't think we can avoid the elephant in the room right now. I would like to ask your opinion about that. We know that the African continent has been apparently one of the less affected by the COVID pandemics. That might be due for instance, to the fact that there is a huge young population that doesn't show up so many symptoms. Also, that might be due to the fact that we don't have enough data on it, or not everyone is getting tested, etc. Anyway, there are plans now for huge mass vaccination. That's one of the points. The other one is, how is COVID helping some of the African pharmaceutics and labs to develop new technology, for instance, in testing. And I'm thinking about South Africa, I'm thinking about Senegal, Tanzania, Kenya, where we can find very good examples of moving on new tests that can be applied to the population. So what are your thoughts about the impact of COVID in the African continent? Is that really such a problem as in Europe? Is it going to be? Is just a problem of not having enough data? Or is that something different there? Is there also an opportunity for developing new technologies that can be done in labs that are within the continent?
Who do you want to go first, Clara?
Sorry?
Who would you like to kick off the debate?
I can just raise her hand, so we can start with you, Faten.
I think there are a few things. I think you're on whether it's affecting Europe, Africa less than Europe. I think the jury is still out there as to the reasons. I think the demography, the fact that Africa is a far younger continent than Europe is one of the main theories also. But the jury is still out there as to why it hasn't affected the continent as much. Having said that, I think the key concern with COVID when it comes to Africa is the repercussions of once we move beyond, basically once vaccines are available, and it depends on what type of restrictions will be introduced internationally to kickstart again a free movement across border, to kickstart trade, to kickstart many things. Basically, I think access to vaccine will be critical. What we see at the moment is that, and that's perhaps one of the lessons of COVID, is that it is very clear that the African continent needs to somehow look at creating or pooling resources. I still think that remains a very key thing. I think no single African country can invest single-handedly in research, particularly on these type of issues alone. So consider perhaps pooling resources to be able to beef up the R&D capacity on the continent. I think you mentioned it, Clara, in what we've seen in Senegal, developing tests that cost less than $1, some innovation taking place in South Africa. But if one, for instance, looks at Senegal, one of the first beneficiaries was the UK. Had we had the systems internally within the continent, it would have been fantastic to provide a platform for that type of innovation to be accessible on the continent. Now, post-COVID, access to vaccine will become very critical. Unfortunately, we are in a situation now that there is a race among a lot of countries, Europe being one of the regions that racing and ordering doses exceeding far beyond its population, and therefore crippling a bit the availability of vaccines. There was good news last week with South Africa having concluded an agreement with to have access to AstraZeneca's vaccine, but we're still far in terms of the continent's full access. Now, some of the international partners have said or committed that they would give the remaining doses to the continent. I think what's important there to say is that what the continent needs is not charity to take, taking leftovers. It's a fair international system that allows it to access vaccines equally. Countries can pay for it, and so for that reason, we've had South Africa take the question to the WTO, and requesting a temporary waiver on trips to be able to produce some of these vaccines of the continent itself to facilitate access. That has been blocked by the EU, the UK, and the US, as well as Japan. And so the question there, it's fantastic to hear partners say, we will give you our leftover. But I think the continent would have liked to say, look, here is an equal international system that will allow you to have equal access without needing us. So creating this new form of dependency almost is rather disturbing, if I'm frank, in a situation where we are going through a major, once in a century, a global pandemic is problematic. So I think we need to pause there and think of the behavior, speaking of multilateralism and promotion of multilateralism of some of the partners. But I think equality in terms of access to vaccine will remain quite critical. And I mean, I'm hopeful that there will be some type of solution somehow. I mean, we've seen this weekend some announcements that the Africa CDC is in discussions with AstraZeneca. So hopefully, again, that's why I was saying earlier, I think pooling resourcing, pooling expertise, having responsible regional institutions negotiate on behalf of the continent with some of these pharmaceuticals is critical. And I think that is most likely the way to go in the future more generally.
Yes, Christine, please. You are muted.
Okay, it's it's a very important debate that is on everybody's mind these days, of course. And I would maybe like to come in with 2 points. One is on the vaccines. I fully agree, Faten, with your assessment on that, and I think this would really be a moment where the EU could, show that it has a strong interest in the partnership by having a more cooperative approach towards the vaccine issue. And I think this would not even be out of charity, but out of the EU's own interest, because I mean there is a strong interest that everybody is getting a vaccine quickly, because we don't know whether there will be any other mutations of the virus, and if it's not, I mean, as long as not everybody is having the vaccine, nobody is safe, so to say. So I think this is also, it would be an issue of where the EU could show that it has really a very strong interest in the cooperation with Africa and is maybe wanting to do things differently, and not just out of charity, but also out of its own interest. And I think in that regard, it would be a positive sign indeed if it was not a discussion where, we can give away vaccines once everybody in Europe is vaccinated, but once the high-risk groups, so the really elderly and people working in medical care are vaccinated, I think then there should also be vaccinations available for African health workers and people working in medical care. That would be very important. But when I look at, coming from Germany, we have a very controversial discussion these days, because people are complaining that it's not even going fast enough, and we have really heavy lockdowns. So it's an issue where I think it would be very important that the EU is doing more, but it's a very difficult issue domestically, politically domestically, where a lot of political communication would be needed. So I would hope that the EU could invest a little more there. And beyond the vaccines, I think it's very important to discuss about the socioeconomic effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, because even if infections have been lower across Africa compared to other regions so far, the socioeconomic impact, of course, is huge. When you look at the jobs that are no longer available, when you look at the fall in remittances and in economic activity. And this is an effect of the direct lockdown in African countries. African governments, fortunately, have been very quick in responding, much quicker than European governments in some regards. But it's also a result of lockdowns in Europe and elsewhere. And there you see that there's I mean, the close connection and socioeconomic connection also has an effect. So, so I think I mean, when we think of EU-Africa cooperation, the vaccine issue is very important, but there's also a very important discussion to be held how to address the socioeconomic repercussions in the medium term and what contributions EU-Africa cooperation can make in that regard. And I think in that sense, it's not very fortunate that when the EU has set up its own recovery plan, the Next Generation EU program of 750 billion that was agreed upon last year, that there was not really funds for international cooperation available in that program. So the EU now has funds in the multi-annual financial framework that was agreed just before Christmas last year, but not as part of the recovery measures that it has internally. So I think, I mean, this might probably be, I mean, how to jointly work on socioeconomic recovery is probably an issue that is also going to be very prominent on the agenda for the summit, and rightly so.
Thank you, Tanya. I don't know if you want to add something.
Yeah, please. I think that there are three sort of elements to this, and I completely agree with Christine on adding the recovery side of things. I think that's crucial. If we look at perhaps some of the reasons why it might appear that Africa has not been quite so badly hit, I think I would certainly concur with Christine in saying that is also because Africa reacted very quickly. And I think that the credit needs to be given where credit is due. They closed borders immediately. I think they've also learned from experience, like from the Ebola outbreak. So I think a lot of measures were taken that Africa can take the moment they could take them. So that's probably to add to your list of reasons why they've perhaps not been so affected, at least not yet. I'd like to again bring this European perspective or EU perspective to the vaccines side of things. And to rebound a little bit on what Christine was saying, Josep Borrell, who is the EU's Minister for Foreign Affairs, if you like, he literally said, if we don't solve the problem in Africa, we will not be able to solve the problem in Europe. Africa is of particular concern to us. So that's a quote. And I was actually quite shocked by that, because first of all, it's still coming from this perspective, this old perspective of solving problems in other countries, which I think that the EU needs to move away from if it is going to be building a new partnership, a proper partnership with Africa. But then I was even more shocked when I compare that with what Ursula von der Leyen, the Commission President, said the moment we started this rollout in Europe, all very proud of ourselves. Our European vaccination days are a touching moment of European unity. And this is where I think what Faten said is so extraordinarily important, because everybody needs to be covered by vaccines. It's almost as though they should be like a global public good, the vaccine, given that we all agree that if we're not all vaccinated, then there's still a risk, or at least the vast majority of us, if we're not vaccinated, then there's still a risk. So I thought it was a great shame that at that point in time, we didn't then say how we're going to be supporting others to make sure that they can get the technology available, to get the patent, whatever it might mean, whatever might be necessary, or indeed to make sure we just also ensure that there's equal access to the vaccine. I know that the EU, just to give them again, credit where credit's due, the EU did say that they'll provide 400 million euros in guarantees to this hashtag COVAX to build and to buy and to deliver the vaccines in low and middle income countries. I suppose what we would want to see is that there's a lot more targeting and a lot more focus on leaving no one behind. So as we're trying to do in Europe, when we actually deliver the vaccines, we're supposed to be focusing on those who are most vulnerable. Well, let's also make sure we do that in support of other countries, making sure that we reach out to those countries who may not be able to get hold of the vaccine quite so quickly themselves, and ensure that they also have it. So this is where I would concur 100% with what Faten was saying. And I think that it goes beyond the geopolitics, although I know that, and this was one of the points that Mariana was mentioning, that it becomes a bit of a geopolitical competition, who can help most the other countries. And I know that this competition is potentially there with China right now, but actually it should be about goodwill and just having everybody's interests at heart, the good, the well-being of all people at heart. And as our first concern. In terms of the recovery, perhaps it would be worth, sort of us having a bit of an exchange on that one as well. I don't know where you want to take this conversation, Clara, but from our perspective, at least, and we don't like the term build back better. We tend to say to rebuild, because we think if you're going to rebuild, then it gives the sense of looking at things differently, reviewing what were the problems in the situation pre-COVID, why did this become, why did it affect, for example, why did it magnify inequalities so much? What were the problems that were out there? So when we rebuild, we can look at the flaws in the system rather than just building back what we had before, but better. So I think that when it comes to these socio-economic impacts, we need to look at what were the real problems that were out there. Like the huge inequalities between people, so who gets most affected and not, and make sure that we actually address these when we look at the recovery period going forward. And let's face it, the real impacts from COVID-19 are going to hit in 2021. So this is really the moment that we all need to be coming together to think, how can we recover or rebuild in a better way, so that economically we can be more resilient, but also so that we invest in, and this goes back to the previous discussant's point, the previous comment rather, of making sure we rebuild the health systems, make them much stronger, make all the systems that we have much stronger. And for that, we need to recognize, I think, the role of the state. And I know I'm moving on to many different topics here, but we tend to forget the very important role of the state in making sure we have strong systems in place to deal with crises like these.
Thank you, Tanya. Well, Faten.
Thanks. Very brief points. I just to support what Tanya said in terms of recognizing COVAX. That some resources have been given to COVAX. I think that's a first step. But what I wanted to add is that COVAX aims to only provide enough vaccines to vaccinate 20% of the population. At the moment, the Africa CDC is targeting a 60%, at least a 60% vaccination level to be able to get close to that herd immunity requirement. And that would require a financing of somewhere between 16 and 20 billion dollars. That's the estimate at the moment. So I think it's important indeed to recognize COVAX, certainly for poorer countries. But I think what we have seen lately is that there's an emphasis on COVAX, but it's not enough. I think we need much more. I think there's a need for far more access indeed to vaccines beyond COVAX. It's just a start.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Well, an example like the one from AIDS, 20 years ago, and the fact that intellectual property rights were dropping out, and now you can have ARTs that are produced in African labs and African enterprises, and that has been really important to fight AIDS spread around the continent. Should it be addressed now as an opportunity? Well, I don't think maybe that's not really the time to answer this, but Faten, if you want to add something.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think the proposal of South Africa at the moment at the level of the WTO is particularly inspired by its experience of IRVs. And they're even asking for a temporary waiver until at least the pandemic levels go down, that we're no longer in a pandemic situation. So it's again, being inspired by what the world should have learned from a previous pandemic to try and drive and find a solution for the current one, and hence why I think cooperation. It's unfortunate that despite that experience and the results that we've seen, I think you're right, Clara. The results that we've seen from providing that flexibility could indeed provide lessons for today.
Yeah. Well, I think we need to answer a question that is here for quite a long time from Amy Tom on our comments. And Amy is addressing particularly the question about the potential, leveraging the potential of African agricultural value chains. The evidence from research and practice reinforces that we have to embrace the concept of sustainable food systems. So that's about food security. But the actual Amy, who has a long experience as a development practitioner, and she was particularly addressing Tanya, but I think everyone can answer this, is asking about, given the reliance on MDBs for Africa's development finance, how can the agenda of domestic diversification be promoted in the face of often conflicting MDBs motivations? She was actually trying to address Tanya's comments.
Is this something you would like me to come in on, Clara?
Sorry?
Is this something you wanted me to come back in on?
Well, because this is a question that has been staying here for, some time now.
From our perspective, as I said, one of the things that we're trying to work on is we have an interest in trying to make sure that all the large EU policies and agreements do not contravene or gainsay the ability of Africa to be able to diversify, whether it's in its agriculture or whether it's in its industrial policies and its manufacturing most particularly. And one of the things that we have noticed when we have analysed a lot of the policies, and we're very happy actually at the moment that they are reviewing their trade policy, because this is an opportunity for us to be putting forward a lot of the recommendations about how one takes a people-centred approach to trade policy or one's agricultural policies or whatever policies one may have. Because what we have noticed when we have analysed their policies is that, as I said much earlier in the conversation, economic growth and profit is at the heart of what the EU is mostly talking about. The main aim of almost any document and any policy that the EU has been putting out over the last couple of decades, I would even say, is around how one creates economic growth. And there's a very particular perspective on this. Whereas what we've been saying for many, many years now is that actually this focus on economic growth is skewing the economy in the wrong direction. And we think that the economy needs to be reoriented altogether and focus much more on people and on the planet. And so when we're putting forward recommendations, this is what we're talking about. What we're trying to do is we're taking a completely different approach from this. We haven't yet started tackling the MDBs. So this is the multinational development banks that Amy is talking about. We haven't yet started addressing them specifically. But when we address the EU, what we're saying is, what does progress look like? What is progress? And what is progress for people and the planet? And this is why the domestic agenda that Amy's been talking about, diversification is so important. Putting Africa's real interests at the heart is so important. What is progress for Africa? And one has to look at it from the African context and from the African perspective. And what we see is that the EU generally comes at things from its perspective. And maybe this takes us into a slightly different conversation, but one of the things that we're calling for is that when the EU is going to be creating its partnerships with Africa, because it's now focusing much more on international partnerships with the name of the title of the commissioner changing. DG Development Cooperation, as it used to be called, International Cooperation and Development, is now moving and changing into the DG for International Partnerships. When it's going to be building its international partnerships, what does it have to do to create genuine, meaningful partnerships which work for both sides? And one of these things is definitely going to be making sure that the African perspective is put at the front and the centre of this. And in our perspective, this has to be just not the EU institutions and the member states, but all the development banks, but also the EIB, for example. So we would be focusing more on the European Investment Bank, and this is absolutely critical.
And that leads us to, well, one of our main questions. It is this really a partnership that we are having here? What is the African perspective for it? Or is this a partnership that is always led by the European interests, or mainly by the European interests? We have already been discussing some part of it, because of course I think that both the European Union and the African Union, they agree in main questions, and main questions are related with economic development, are related with climate change, are related with digitalization, are related also with the implementation of human rights, etc., are related with employment. But how is this going to be implemented? So is this really a partnership? Yeah, Tanya, then Faten.
Happy to just throw out a few ideas to start this one off. I think the EU is genuine in wanting to move on in the way it has approached its relationship with Africa. However, I think there's an awful lot that needs to actually happen to enable that, or to make that actually come about. In the past, as we know, I mean, apart from the sort of the slightly neo-colonial approach that the EU has, if we take it from a historical perspective, you have the institutions and countries like the EU and its member states being donors. So you had this notion of donorship. Then one realized that this donor-beneficiary relationship was really not working at all, and one needed to put the country in that one was trying to support in more of the driving seat. So you have ownership, and this ownership language and vocabulary became much more important. And now we're moving on from even this into this partnership approach, which I think is to be welcomed. But it does mean that there's a few very vital changes that need to happen, and I think that we're not quite there yet. One of the ones that I think would need to happen is indeed, and I referred to this just a moment ago, is looking at the systems that one has in place in the relationship and between, in this instance, the continents of Europe and Africa. Look at the economic, the financial, the political, the governance systems that are in place, the policies and the practices which are part of them, to see whether they're functioning in the interests of both of the parties, or whether in fact they are, in part at least, responsible for what we consider to be quite huge inequalities and injustices between the two parties. And what would one need to do to rectify any imbalances in these systems, in the power of the two sides? So it is a lot about the power, I would say. The second thing that I think that would need to happen if we're really taking a partnership approach would be that we need to transition from this rather transactional kind of relationship, which has dominated so far, at least, right up to now, I would tend to say, into a more transformational kind of relationship. Where everybody's agenda counts, and one works in the interests of creating obviously advantage for both parties. I think win-win is too simplistic, but it's about meaningful outcomes for both parties, where both parties' interests and concerns are jointly concerned and jointly worked on. And I think this jointly is really important, because generally what I think tends to happen when we get the EU, when we look at the EU-Africa relationship at least, is that the EU has already thought it all through and comes to the table always with its proposal. We see this a little bit with this EU-Africa strategy that was adopted back in March 2020. Mm-hmm. Whereas what might be more beneficial if one's really trying to create a partnership is actually to work this through together to come to a joint outcome and a joint agreement on a way forward based on these common interests. and common projects, and then to work, for example, and this is just an example in terms of how one implements it, in terms of joint governance. How are we going to jointly identify the projects we want to work on for joint funding, and then jointly oversee them? So it's this jointly bit which I think is important in the partnership, and at which we don't really see at the moment. So far, at least, it's been, okay, well, what are the key things? What are the priorities? This is super important for the EU. Let's put it on the agenda no matter what. Then we're going to identify where we want to put our money. There may be some small consultation in country, if we're lucky, run by the EU delegation. And then we'll decide whom we're going to give our money to. And it's very one-way street. And I think this is part of what needs to change. And it won't happen easily, but I think that there is genuine interest in making that kind of change from the EU side. There's this term that is being used a lot at the moment, geographization of aid. And what that basically means is localization, so that the EU is increasingly trying to put the EU delegation in the driving seat, so that the EU delegation can identify, based on knowledge of the local context, what's important. Again, here, what is so important is working in conjunction with local partners. And if that local consultation doesn't happen, if we don't reach out and actually work on things together, then I think, again, this partnership notion won't go very far.
Mm-hmm. Tanya, just before giving the floor to Faten, can you explain a little bit who are you thinking about when you speak about local partners?
I'm most particularly, I come from civil society, so of course I'm most particularly talking about local civil society. So I think that when local civil society understands the needs and the gaps of the people in the local communities, civil society is often out there as part of local communities and working with local communities to try and improve the situation. So at least one of the stakeholders that would need to come on board are local civil society organisations who can represent more marginalised groups. However, I actually think that one can go much further than that and to say local authorities need to be brought in, local associations need to be brought in, local employers associations, for example, should be brought in. I don't think that this is restricted, but I think that this idea of local is very important. And local for me doesn't just mean those based in the capital, who are easy to access. And that generally is what happens. What I would be hoping is that dialogue can be spread to other towns. And with urbanisation that Christine was briefly mentioning earlier on, with urbanisation, that might become a little bit easier. With the digital technologies, everything, it might become easier, but I think that's very, very important.
Mm-hmm. And don't you think that civil society organizations are completely underfunded to complete with that kind of expectations that are putting over them?
It's not just a question of underfunding, I would say, Clara. There is obviously going to be an element of that, but there are an awful lot of other factors that count here as well. One of them is civil liberties, the degree to which one can actually even speak out and freely. The second is the how the consultations might go about. As we're all aware, there are many different languages that are spoken when one goes into communities, and it's not just maybe that main national language that is going to be able to be used if one wants to consult with particularly marginalized groups. So I think that there's a lot of awareness raising to be done. There's a lot of working with people to be done. So it's not just a question of funding, and this is a process. But very definitely, by plugging into those local organisations that already exist, I think one can get an awful lot of information that one can usefully use when one's trying to build programmes and use one's funding in the most efficient and effective manner.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'm going to give the floor to Faten and Christine, but before, because we are coming to the end, there is a comment from Fernando Jorge Cardoso that can be also addressed while we answer. That is, there are advances in the partnership, but also big tricky issues remaining, and these are not only in the EU side. Several African leaders still have this neo-colonial acceptance approach that they assume as long as money is provided. The post-Cotonou Agreement is an example of that. What I mean is that, unfortunately, Africa as a whole is still to be attained, but of course the road is there. So, putting this comment from Fernand George and together with the question on, is this really a partnership? I believe that Faten wanted to answer first, and I'll give you, and then we'll end as we started with Christine.
I think Tanya actually raised a lot of the points that I also wanted to raise. So maybe let me emphasize them, a couple of them. I think the key point is that this is a process. Change is always difficult, and let alone in a between two regions with a history that has not been always smooth. And so I think, I mean, one can be optimistic, though. I think there has been quite some movement, certainly in the last 20 years, in the ways that Europe and Africa relate to each other. I think, you know, a lot of at times I hear this comment of African assertiveness. I think I would agree with it, but I think it comes from a change in one within Africa itself. I think we need to recognize that agency. There's also a generational change in Africa. I mean, to take also the point of Fernando, I mean, a lot of people of a younger generation is far more confident with what the continent has to deliver, and has perhaps a different ambition on where it wants to put the continent. So I think we need to take into account also that generational change, and we're in fact starting to see some of its impact on the way Africa relates to the world, not just to Europe, to some degree already. It's I mean, for those who are inside also, I think it's very easy to see that there are more and more solid content-driven discussions when it comes to be it negotiations or things like that. So I mean, I tend to be looking at it in a long time frame, and with what Tanya also said, rightly so, that it's a process. I think we are moving in towards a direction where it's no longer that you know, aid-driven relationship. I mean, also because the proportion of aid in African, the contribution of aid in Africa's GDP has declined drastically since the 1990s. So that leverage that the partnership, well, that the relationship, not a partnership, the relationship has to make it transactional is eroding, and that in itself would drive some change. The last point, the point on joint governance structures that Tanya raised, is critical. When the Africa strategy, the so-called Africa or strategy with Africa, I believe is the correct title, was released. The point that I often made is that it's very easy to agree on the themes of the partnership. We all know climate is important, peace and security are important, etc. The challenge is in the details. The devil is in the details. And we do need those, not just in terms of agreeing on priorities, but on agreeing on how we're going to tackle those priorities, how we're going to remain accountable on how we do that. How do we keep track and evaluate, assess, readjust what we've been doing? And that requires joint governance, which has been eroding in the last years. The Lisbon was the agreement that was reached in Lisbon in 2007 initially provided for this type of framework, so loose one. But that has been eroding over the last 5 years or so. And so we need to bring that back, because it's now even more critical than it was back then, to ensure that that space for fluid dialogue and systematic dialogue, not just between summits or between ministerials, but systematic dialogue at all levels is there.
Yeah, sorry, just before giving the word to Christine, when you speak about a kind of a systematic dialogue, what are you thinking about exactly?
Well, it's really this point on a joint governance structure that or setup. In the African Union, it would be, for instance, I think it's referred to as an instrument, and so the point there is that you need a regular a dialogue, be it, I mean, you raised, for instance, or Tanya said, for instance, earlier, civil society. I think that's not to be excluded, but it also needs to take place between recognized, responsible institutions. At the end of the day, this is international relations. And so we need to ensure that the right actors are on the table. I think the EU has taken to some degree the habit of picking and choosing who it negotiates with or who it discusses with. That's been an irritant. I think in many ways it's undermined rather than helped the partnership. So dialogue with the different actors, dialogue with the relevant actors, and dialogue even with those that are inconvenient to you in that particular moment of time. I think that's the key still to opening. I think we need to agree that, you know, a partnership, in a partnership, we agree to disagree, and that's fine. But as long as we find ways then to still move forward on and deliver on what we agree and eventually build on that.
Thank you, Faten. Christine, we have a last question here that also relates with the partnership. And is this really a partnership or a partnership where we agree to disagree, as Faten was putting it? And the question is particularly, how is this partnership going to be addressed? Thinking also about the role of China, and for instance, the role of China in supporting infrastructures in Africa. For instance, just think about the Road and Belt Initiative and how it's affecting. Well, I know this is a long question to end the debate, but if you can put a little bit inside of that to help answering the question by Walter.
Well, I think we could have another 1.5 hours discussion about that topic. So it's a challenge to do that in a concluding word. But maybe let me just start with the question you initially put. I mean, a lot has been said already by Tanya and Faten, but maybe to nuance one or two things. I very much agree that maybe the Europe and Africa need to look for a different governance mechanism and different structures. But I think there's also a need for a different mindset towards the partnership. And I think this is actually true for both sides. So we have a mindset which is due to historic legacies and also structural asymmetries that is still very much driven by the idea that there's the problem which is on the African continent, and Europe is going to work on that jointly with African partners. And I think the mindset would need to move much more towards where are common problems, where are common opportunities, and how can both sides work jointly in order to address them. And I think discussions that we started off with on green transitions are one opportunity in order to move towards a different mindset, because it's very clear that Europe has no solutions on that. And there's a lot of learning that is needed, and this can and should be organized in a much more horizontal and joint way. And well, Europe is not the only important partner for African countries, but there's of course China as well. Maybe for those interested in China and China-Africa cooperation, the Chinese government has published a new white paper on its international development cooperation yesterday, which is interesting because it shows that development cooperation with Africa continues to be a high priority. So 45% of Chinese aid continues to go to Africa, and much of that as grant aid and concessional loans. But it's not just a development partnership and an economic partnership, but what I think is new in the past couple of years, and especially important for the EU as well, is that it's becoming more of a political partnership, and China is becoming much more of a political competitor as well. And I think, well, we haven't discussed much on the governance issues and democracy and human rights issues, but I think this is one of the important debates to be held in the future, because there's clearly an alternative political model as well, and there's a question of, I mean, what do African societies and governments want from the EU? Because the EU makes a very different offer in that regard. And maybe to conclude, just very briefly, I mean, last year has been dominated by COVID, and we haven't seen the summit, we haven't seen the leaders meeting in December. So it has not been an easy year for EU-Africa relations, and I think we should hope that this year, under the Portuguese presidency, and then afterwards, the partnership is going to be taken up with the new mindset and with the new energy, in order to make sure that I mean, there are big issues to be tackled, and in order to not lose the window of opportunity to actually do that.
Thank you a lot, Christine. And well, thank you everyone for this wonderful debate. I think we have addressed some major questions, and we left a lot of them out of this debate. So we needed more, 1 hour and a half, actually, sorry, to continue with this. Well, thank you so much to everyone, and thank you so much for our audience. And I hope we will meet again soon in a debate like this, maybe concerning a summit that will have a concrete date and a concrete schedule agenda. See you later in another debate. Bye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.